Process over line signals over lines of pi is zero line rotations. This travels point lines of graph and direct line communications convergence system of three settings. How this directs the link is process communication lines of high travels. Gets you guys out of thinking, thoughts, lines of action, emotions. It has no detection screen, adaptation, or flux. Processing, indicate, modify. That it puts position, location, and pi generation lines into overdraft. Now that process line communication setting. So every time you guys speak in line screen adaptation, it erases lines of screens. On center, on sequence, on pi. Get out of the thoughts of thinking and process everything moving forward. Every lines in the high centers is over lines of 0. That process indicates lines over 1 over attractions. The convergence system is also the setting, guys. Now you have to understand how to modify that, space modulation of just the empty space itself. That's right, empty space itself. You can't have you guys in a story frame line condition setting if there's no story to coordinate through. There's no story at all because it's just the mind of empty space that we have to process that position because you're over soul. It's now its own system. Everything around its own system is out of the now. So we're 0 plus, okay, sometimes a negative over screens, 3 centers of travel, 4 centers of measure, 7 calculation lines, 5 directions, 12 setting lines, 12 setting sequence, 12 setting space, and 12 setting location of travel. All right, so we indicate line connection 3 over lines, 4 over sequence, 7 over pi. That indicates lines of 0. Process lines, directed signals 144 equals 0. Okay, now 0 is a correlation is a time measure that overlines this time setting of sequence locations over pi. Process indicates line calculation grounds in a 4 line signals, 4 centers of measure, 0 calculations, and 3 calculate modify. Overline sequence, over lines of pi, 3 generation screen lines, earth rotation surface, and platforms over set attractions. Directing ground centers, we take the 3 centers, process lines over cross lines of 4, 7 over measure, position of plus, negative over screen, and 4 centers of calculations. Directing online settings, process lines indicate line connections, how you set positional walls, line rotation, line calculations, green location system, 0 line rotations, platforms over lines, solar panels, and process calculations and prototypes. Modification setting of travel, point lines of graph, center of calculations, 3 centers, 4 centers lines of travel, 3 set position lines of calculation. Inside calculation modify, directing ground centers and line communications into now lines and sequence lines of panel. Your solar system is in line tractions. Your galaxy alignments are in solar line division. 4 centers lines of calculation data over sequence over pi. Transitions over attractions over draft. 4 set calculations. Offline signal, location, ground centers, and sequence line communications in opposite direction locations. Setting panel operation sequence, panels communication line, position lines, centers, transitions over transactions, modification high centers, line communication positions to a set track communication. Directing ground centers on center in location system in its convergence system all through travel. Very complicated stuff, but it's a lot of fun. Okay? How this is set up out of now is an outline sequence of process indication lines and high centers. All right, so you got 12 line centers, process indication lines and position lines of 2 flux over centers into habitation and inhabitations. That's process over 6 over line. So we take the 6 lines, we time the sequence into 1 measure, time the sequence into 0, time the sequence into 1. Now, remember the time frame sets course centers calculated on arrows of indication where it's going and 4 centers of communications, indirect signals in all directions all at once in flux. Now, indicate lines calculation of the platform is the bridging, offline, inside rotation lines and grounds. 2 bridging lines, course centers, 1 platform over E factors over Q. Directing solar sail and dimensional sail rotation lines of going forward and travel. There it is. A flagging system puts position lines of arrows at dynamics and location as sending a screen. Over screen adaptations in processing. Over lines, echo, indicates lines of travel. 3 centers, 4 lines of set calculations. Now directing lines, waving screens, alpha, delta, beta, theta, omega, zeta, zeta. And gamma is on standby in rotations. Now gamma operates the signals into travel point lines and 3 centers of graphs and 3 set lines of travel. On centers in location setting to a bridging rotation with webbing system and calculation. All right. So 3 panels operation line calculation setting of screens. Directing ground centers online sequence in waving panels. Indicates platforms over factors, over flux over screen location. Now the indicate lines has a location grid. We process line conditions of bridging of 4 centers of signal. That indicates position of platforms that overlines the drive line screen adaptations of its flux. Process line core centers and two X lines of 1. Process X lines of overlines of sequence. Indicates 4 centers of travel. It's going to get more complicated in your graph and screen adaptation settings that operates the system and your pyramids and graph communication. Now indicate the settings of the calculation. Okay, so you have to understand how to structure your divisions out of now sequence, out of outline center into outline sending locations out of the now. Okay, no thought provision lines of thinking and position because it races the settings of seconds, minutes, hours, and frame. So your division lines is a solar sail, 3 centers and 4 set communication lines of calculations. Copy that. On center line communications, 3 centers of travel, crossing angles of both lines of flux over a platform. Side of calculation of ground centers on line sequence of lines of pi. The process indicates the system all through travel, in directions, and all can modify. So it gets more complicated as we go through higher lines of structure, design lines of sequence and locations. Okay? Your web and screens are now the outline center and now outline center lines of sequence locations, platform communications convergence into panels. Structure divisions outline centers into new bridging and screen adaptation. Okay, that process indicates lines of flux and 3 centers in scale. Okay, so we have to understand the position location where it's going through travel as a direct line condition setting over line sequence of travel. 4 centers of travel, webbing screen lines adaptations of flux over set travel, directing interpyramid, row graph screens, and flux over set travel communication. Now, that indicates line condition setting to its panels of screen lines and 45 communication lines of angles and travel communications. New sky grid comes in and sky lines into all levels of Skynet. Skynet. High signals, high communication exceed 1,000 platforms over setting and sequence, mothership over line rotations, travel indicates lines, calculation lines, X211, X2 line 3, and X2 flux. That process indicates lines of travel. Outside in and rotation surface and travel communications. So we have to understand the point graphs where we're going in set position over lines over now. That indicates our settings over lines of flux. The process and communication lines position as portals directs lines and links in the communication setting, a new portal communication system and convergence system into face recognition and positions of its facade. Face recognition. All right. So directing lines of link. Process indications how we go through centers of travel. Okay, so again, we start with the 6 line, over lines of centers, process of 6 over 2. 2 set lines of 3, set position of 4, but we don't align centers to 5 until we bypass everything and portal communication 3 centers of travel. Now, that indicates all communicates to its position all through now. 5 lines of now, 5 lines of sequence of now, 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 now. Operation overline sequence over now. Inset line communication. Okay? Now, set that position lines of 2 line centers, sets dimensional sail and rotational lines in the opposite direct location setting in sequence. Sets calculation of ground centers, online centers, energetic probing, and direct lines of grounds. High signal lines of travels, tethers, rotates 3 centers of grounds, 4 centers of measure, 5 lines of scale, 6 lines of communication setting into position locations, the routes, the routers, location system of the calculation. Very complicated stuff, but it's a lot of fun. All right, so tether lines of time reactor and flux over set on travel communications. Directing ground centers into omega 13. Platforms over E factors. Indicates over cross location of screen lines of 3 centers of travel. Directing infrastructures of new timeline center and sequence location of panel. Process indicates line conditions over cross location of screens. Sets position locations in its perimeters. Data formation lines outline center line rotation system out of outline lines and line communication position lines of calculation. Inside rotations, inside line condition settings, convergence system, process line direct line ground centers, and operation lines of travel. Inside rotations is a portal communications of convergence system through I-set tractions, I itself. I centers its position, outline signals, outline travel, directing 3 grounds into pi generations, Echo, Zulu, Foxtrot, and rotation lines of setting. Sets operation line sequence and convergence system all through traction. Very complicated stuff, guys, but it's a lot of fun. All right. E factors over Q over question over lines of mark into oculars. Oculation, correlations into coarse centers, lines of travel. Sets an I sequence, lines of panel, in process of indication system, all through its position as convergent system out of the now. That's you out of the now and set lines of sequence. All right. Now, team line is the units, is the process of indication lines and high position lines of overdraft. Let's say you're in line communication into 18,000 graphs. Set position negative over lines into 2 negatives over plus. Cross lines of positive over negative in screen location. Now, that indicates lines of 8 lines of value, 8 lines of time, 8 lines of structure, and 8 lines of locations. Flywheel attractions off-center. Cross lines propellers, directing outline signals, and 3 grounds of surface in rotational lines, outline signal location setting, and grounds lines of calculation. Sets communication in position, so all levels have confusion and location with setting. So, sets calculation ground centers, online sequence, and panels and rotational line circuits, and rotational lines of ground communication and conversions. Setting travels in direct lines and line connection system is knowing exactly how to go through pi generators lines over pi. Process indicate line centers, process communication system up through 4 centers of measure, 3 centers of scale. Perimeters, 3 centers of rotations, offset calculations, 3 grounds, 3 travels, 3 centers, 2 lines of signals, question over screen into line center, question over line conditions underscore, question over line center, question over line communications, E factors over setting, process lines of 2, A equals lines of C, C equals lines of D, and A equals lines of C over A. It's that communication. Directing portals of communication lines of high centers, process indicate lines of calculation 1/5 over screen and direction. Offline signals in ground centers line sequence location of flux over set lines of travel. Calculation ground centers of bridging and rotation lines of 4 centers of sequence. 2 centers of measure, 3 centers of scale. Bridging and location ground centers and set line communication. There's the bridge. Now, the bridge comes in online center. Online sequence, online panel, 3 centers of scale that operates the windows and frame that we allocate timelines, set lines of sequence in parallel. Process indicates lines of box frames. Change communication lines of simulation lines of 1 signals, 2 graphs, 3 centers, 4 travels. Inside rotations only and 2 travel communications. Then we set the high coarse centers and perimeters over lines of 0 calculations at 4 graphs. Set calculation lines over line signals into 2 graph communication. Directing ground centers and 3 centers of travel. And we change the convergent system all through travel. Okay? Set calculation of code line centers, triangulation line conditions in, triangulation line rotation, triangulation line communication in position to its operation set travel. Set calculation high centers and location setting to a graphical screen and set travel communication to its window frame. Sets convergence over locking line communication system to its cerebro. There's the cerebro. Locking doors and mechanism lines in 1 pattern, process lines of 0, 0, 0, and 0 over 1 over travel. Directing ground centers, online centers, and mapping line course centers and directions. All through settings, all through triangulation of mapping centering line communication lines of pi. Indicate high centers, line communication with locking mechanisms and time frame line condition setting is 0, 1. Locking screens, directing ground centers, online sequence. Simulation grounds, process lines of indication setting over travel. Overlooking and position lines into over line center, line communications over now and sequence. Observing in ground centers of set travel, process lines and positions, inside rotations, set lines of 1, 2, and 3 centers of scale. Sets calculation of ground centers, online centers, platforms over E factors over Q square roots, and set lines of communication. Indicate flux lines, direct lines of grounds, open lines of box frames, and window frames of travel communications and direction. Okay, so I'm just showing you the process of the expanding that you guys come into as you come out of the now. As you get in positions, it gets much easier to see in this design in position of inside rotation to outside location, which is online centers and out of the now lines of set and travel. So that indicates all lines of flux now. Now we have to process that how to use the alphabetical blocking line condition setting over lines of pi. Now that indicates lines over red over sequence, securities and perimeter. Parameter line, lacing line, glazing line, formation lines over cross location, 1, 3 centers, travel point lines over lines of pi in set travel, point lines of graph, and central line communications converge the system all through one lines of flux. Now that process indicates the lines of calculation screen locations until calculate modified. Clocking centers, 3 centers, 4 scales. Sets graph communication. Okay, so it's going to get a lot more complicated because you're out of the outline center. Line communicates and convergence location out of the now. 1, 3 grounds and higher south. Platforms at different levels and set lines of sequence. Okay, 1/3 lines of flux or 3 centers of measure. Cross indicates an line connection setting at a snowy graph interference. Rotates the valves, location setting and calculations. Directing lines of length, the cross line connections body frame, rotates the lines of body formation line course centers at E factors over truth, narrative over rotation, ground centers into square roots. Setting line communication of webbing screens, adaptations and travel. On centers of panel, echo, zoner, line conditions of Zuller, line rotation setting and travel. Graph communications convergence system, all through tractions, all through travel. Directing line, ground centers, line communication position of convergence on line communication lines of travel. Sets course centers, directing ground centers, solar system comes in a convergence system out of the now line sequence. 3 centers of flux into all line rotations and the earth line rotation. Correlations, attractions, and divisions and divergence, allegiance of a new lines and rotation. All right, so having center course centers of the earth line sets perimeters over habitations over 6 over measure. That process indicates lines of setting. Inside travel, alteration setting of travel, directing in position location of Saturn. Saturn lines its communications, convergence over Saturn line communication with Pluto, sets security position lines and line communications of Neptune, sets course centers in Mercury, and rotates the course centers, line communications, sending and travel. 4 centers and calculation screen locations. In direction. So we center off the system and we change course centers of time frame and simulation grounds. So that communicates inside travel, in direction set location of setting and configuration lines of windows and frame. On centers, on sequence, on panel, process indicates an online centers and communications and convergence. On setting, on sequence line positions, directing ground centers on travel. Crossing provision lines of cycles sets communication new graphing, new mapping. Rotates the line screen adaptations of flux. Up the stairs, 4 centers of communications and convergence. Down sent lines over lines of pi. Cross lines of center over lines of communications. Inside travel, directing lines and position lines of flux. Correlate the communication lines of convergence system to parallels, directing lines into projections. Over lines of pi over generation. Time centers, online center, online panel. Process indicates lines of 0 gravity. Process lines of 0 rotations into transition. Setting course centers of time frame and travel. Sets lines of platforms and E factors over screen location. So it's very complicated stuff how this is all set up in perimeters of parameters, guys. Inside rotations and travel calculations in all direction. All right, so we go through portal communicates outside line centers, 3 centers of measure. Sets course centers of calculation setting. Okay, directing lengths, process indication over lines, screen adaptations of travel. Now, the inside line condenses in outline rotations, clocking lines of zeros, process indicates lines over lines of pi. Inside travel communications convergence system of the calculations. Directing lines and length, process indicates the setting of the calculation. All right, done by equation. All right. Center screens is a communication of its positions. You know exactly how this is set up through all track location of your settings now. Add a line, center location, and setting, operation line positions. Okay, so we go through L tracks into cells. Cells are in an LQ line rotation and travel point lines of graph and interline connection setting. Sets operation lines of sequence, panels of rotation, 3 centers of travel. Inside line, sets course centers in rotation, or ground centers and point communication of graphs, indicate line connection setting of flux. Now, they have arrow indications going in 4 different directions. Each cell modifies the ground centers of sequence lines of panel. Now, that indicates centers of operation and travel communication in all directions in 1 center travel communication. Cell modification lines of 2 panels, 3 cells at generation lines of screen, acceleration over time frame and set travel. Online centers, online communications positions, its operation. Directing ground centers, online position lines of L track over E factors over C track, which is all line communications. Set position lines at high position, transition location to a setting, merges its correlations out of now and sequence, and new bridging set lines of cycle. Process indicates line connection settings, structure line division locations through pi. Very complicated stuff. Arrow indicates lines of flux. Then we just have one prototype, one direct lines of model, and modification ground centers, assembly location setting, and 3 tubings, 3 graphs, 3 measure, 3 scales, and graph communication. Inside rotations, and pyramid activation rotation lines of surface. Inside calculations. Security lines measure. Process lines indicate lines of 1 over tractions over 3 over measure. Core time frame. Process lines indicates lines on line center green. Says communication on the line center location of black. Says position lines at center location over purple. Says position location line conditions and high position lines of pink. Says communication line position location of online centers back in blue. Set the operation line sequence location line position location line condition of green. Says position location line communication position over now lines ascending over travel. Says communication high position location system of the calculation sending through brown. Says communication line position location convergence. Says calculation green lines communication lines of E lines of factor location sending through all flux location of sending of travel. All set communication high centers. Process lines of indication system of the calculations. Directing ground centers online sequence online pi. Done by equation. The convergence system has a time frame. The time frame locates the line condition sets convergence system. All through hours of seconds lines of frame. Process lines of north, east, line position of west, south line communication setting, geometric lines, operation lines setting, ground centers of sequence over cross lines, waving line rotations, and 3 grounds of set lines of set line communication voicing pattern. Process indicates line connection setting is an alpha line wave. Alpha got 1 delta and 1 theta. Operation lines and frame communication in convergence system and Schumann resonance. Process indicates lines of flux over screen locations. Now we get an alpha tone, 2 beta theta center lines, process lines, and systematic line core centers, calculated lines of symbiote. Indicate line ground centers, process lines of frame line current centers, and box frame location of window frames. Process indicates lines of ground centers, online sequence, bedded in screen, 3 centers of travel, 4 centers of measure. Says calculating ground centers, line communication inside programs, and 2 processing line direct line communications. Setting convergent lines at ground, symbolism line communicates lines, metric meters over scale, communicates line position location, ripples effect communicates lines of greens, high center lines of travel, directing lines position of flux, online screen adaptation of travel, directing lines, online center line communication. All through graphical strings. Okay, so we set the provision and location setting of grounds and high lines of sequence. Process indicates lines of platforms over E factors, new structure, new division, new locations, 45 set lines of travel, direct lines of simulation grounds, and on-set travel. Set it communicates in high position location, use solar position line connection setting. Solar beam and rotation lines and security lines positions. Process lines indication over 2, over 3, over flux, over 4, over 6, over 7, over 8, and over 12, and set lines of travel. Directing ground centers, line connection setting, set position locations. Echo, sonar, flux over 1. Process indicates an online center and graphical screens to set travel communications. Very complicated stuff, but it's a lot of fun. So remember, this is already set up, but we have to understand the now sequence out of the now line rotations and travel communication, seconds, minutes, hours, and frame. All right, so we indicate the graph line that sets, of course, centers of time frame. Inside the locations, the alpha line, beta wave communication lines of window frames. On centers of panel, process lines of indication over travel. Inside rotations, travel point lines of graph, pyramid, astro projections, astro travels. Process of platforms over E factors over square root into 45 angled split lines of anomaly. Sets ground centers online signals. Process lines indicates over travels and direct lines of communication system, all through calculations, all through direction. Recourse centers, portal communication lines, and half pipe, 3 centers of calculation. Inside, outside, outside, in, outside, out, and rotation and travel communications and convergence. Setting sequence of platforms over factors, directing ground centers online sequence. Gold streams, 3 centers of travel, and 3 line communications of convergence. Sets over lines of echo frame, directing lines of Zulu Fox location. Set calculation lines of flux over 3, center line communication position of 12 o'clock in system, 12 lines of 0, 0 lines of 12. So we're in a convergence system of 0, 0, 0, process lines equal lines of 12, line position of 0, 0, 0, position lines of 4 lines of setting, 4 sequence, 3 lines of measure. set position lines of setting. Process lines over 777, track communication lines of 888, position lines of 9999, set course center 69, and rotation of center operates lines of over lines of now. Process indication setting. Indicate goal lines of flux. Indicate line center location of yin and yang. Process indications done by equation. All right, center calculation setting of units. Process indications of platform. Sets of E factors over lines into square root of the course centers of calculation screen locations that indicates time frame and travel communications that direction. Inside calculation screen locations done by equation. So it gets very complicated when you get position lines of high lines of confusion now, because the set course centers puts lines and high center lines in infusion itself. Multiple levels of molecular design line rotates the cycles lines of one infusion over screen. Protons, lines, and electrical line connection setting, one cell line modification, one molecule. 4 frames flux over box frame. 3 centers of measure. That puts in 100% line connections at percentage. Directing lines is equals lines of 0. Triangulation into box. Online centers on panel. Over cross location of sync locations. Now, directing lines on online center, process lines over lines of 1 over lines, process line connection setting. 2 arrows of indication lines, direct and redirect. Set position lines of set position 0, 0, 0. Set lines of now. Equalize course centers, eraser line rotations. Correlation setting. Travel point lines of 0, 0, 7. Indicates over cross location lines and angles of point lines of graph. Directing ground centers is a 3-box frame. Now that triangulates position over lines of program that has a line course centers line communication to its road graph screen locations, graph calculation screen locations. Now, changing time to scale changes communication lines of window frame. That indicates line conditions of box frame, triangulation and correlations of clocking frame communication. Directing online setting, online sequence, 3 lines of pi, process lines of 4 lines of measure, 5 lines of scale of communication. Inside travels, sets calculation ground lines and high positions. Yes, team, I just need you to observe. It's very complicated what I'm doing. Online centers, online travel. Directing line box frame into embedded over screen locations of box frames and communication 3 centers of scale. Sets calculation of ground centers, inside rotations, and travel calculating line connection setting calculation. Directing inside line rotations, travels of point lines and direct lines into window frames and communication setting, and it's converted the system into time. Okay, so we're in time scale. Okay, mind interpretations in 3 centers of travel. Cerebral cortex, out of the outline center, line communication and position lines of high position of wires. 2 line centers of blue and 3 centers of 3 line rotation line connected to red. Outline signals into positions. Now we mask the volume. Set over lines of travel, set line communication positions, 3 centers line communication convergence into coloration lines of time frame. Sets coordinates and line communication lacing and communication setting of wires of indications. Inside travel, point lines of graph, 1 set lines, 0 operation and 0 travel. Outside signal and location setting and convergence system, all 3 directions. All 3 directions, all 3 locations. All set up. So as this is set up, it's a convergence system of the calculations. Very complicated stuff, but what you have to understand, the graphing screen just puts all communication to your solar system, communication to its grounds, online set lines, the earth line rotations. Now we go through 6 habitation zones. Now each cell is a modification of each cell. That modifies the ground and modify. So we go to position lines of high centers of graph, communication lines of high centers, boxing frame. We go through 3 positions, 3 angles, 3 graphs. Correlate calculation, 1 xt, 1 xt, 1 position, 1 mothership. Course centers back in frame, back into correlations, back and now, line screen adaptation of travel. Outside line centers, 1/3 graph, alpha, delta, theta rotations, waving screen location. Inside line condition setting, convergence system, all 3 earth line rotations, 6 lines of 1. Crossover 2, 3 centers of measure, 3 centers of scale, 4 centers of calculations, question over mark. Directing ground centers on sequence, on panel process line. 3 centers of flux, correlate the communication lines of convergence system, all 3 setting, and rotation lines of ground calculating modify. Directing online center. Location, dark matter. Dark signals, dark communications, dark signal. Sets calculation ground centers of 4 centers of flux over line course centers out of the outline sequence of void and rotation lines of setting. Jitter rotations, high centers lines of travel, direct lines of link, and direct lines of panel. String theory, directing on centers, location system, and convergence system of the calculations. 4 centers of planetary lines and 3 centers of measure and scale. Operates line calculation screen locations done by equation. The set calculation of height centers is a webbing line center rotation. Now, setting communication height centers, let's put position of box frames, 3 centers of scale. Okay? Set position of 3. You guys have to understand how to use the coordinates in formula line connection setting to your own calculus. The high lines of centers into D factors, process lines of E factors, process lines of transition, into transference, into one transcendence, and one frame communication. Complicated stuff because you don't understand the line condition setting to a position location to its setting. Solar sail, 3 centers of travel, directing on-center line communication convergence system off the calculation. Inside lines are platforms, 3 centers of 4 centers, 5 lines of travel, and cerebral cortex, a memory line. Inside line conditions convergence system, all through now, outline setting, outline division, outline high center locations, and the convergence system, all through settings. Online center, online sequence, online panel, particle accelerations of parallels, direct lines, position, particle acceleration system, overload connection setting, process lines of indication setting, all through string theory, the process indication line connections, all lines, online center, online communication convergence system, solar net, solar communication, solar stream, directing lines, position lines of solar sail, process line communication convergence system, all through attractions. Done by equation. All right, so it's all set up line condition lacing lines. All right, so once we understand line course centers to travel, then we understand the position locations of what's void. Now we set the void lines, set lines of 0 gravity. That goes into transits or transactions. Now that process lines in inventory. That sets communication lines to your F screens, process lines of film, online, outline, inside, rotation lines of surface and travel. Now we got divots. It's going to get complicated, guys. I'm just trying to get you to understand what's going on in positions. You guys have to truly understand the importance of what I'm doing. So you get a true understanding of how to modify and set location of screen lines, adaptations, and position transits over lines as cells. That modifies the system of the track locations and direction. Transits over lines of platforms over factors over 1 over 2 over 3 over travel. Ground centers and foundation lines of film strip over 3 centers lines, communication lines, convergence over travel. Boxing frame, time centers, film line over line screen adaptations bending space. 3 centers calculation grounds. Dimensional sail over cross locations. Inside communication. Now, directing ground center online centers, platforms over 2 factors, E factors over 4, set lines of 5 over 6, 7, 8 lines of measure and scale. Process indication online centers of platforms over E factors over Q. Directing ground centers, XC1000 over platform, XC1000 over track communication of its system. Directing ground centers, platforms over E factors, and position line set location of simulator. Now, understand the transitions over flow is a process lines of alpha, set lines of A, position lines of alpha over D, D centered lines of E, E process lines of C, C equals lines of B, B equals lines of 1. Set coordinate of 0, 1, 0, 0, 0, triangulation in box. Is set communication. Now, how that's set up is knowing exactly how to coordinate the communication of traffic inventories, 3 centers of travel. Now, inside locations, directing ground centers and line position of point graphs. Directing online centers, of course, the communication lines are part of extreming locations. That's right. Docking centers over lines indicate over. Set position lines and high positions over lines of under. Inside outline centers, 4 lines of flux over line. Directing inside bracket over screen. Directing line outline center line communication of sonar, 2 XT1000 line, 1 rotations, 1 rotation line ground centers of flux over screen locations. Directing inside line condition setting convergence system, Fibonacci lines of 1 signal and 1 rotation. Part acceleration line condition echo sonar, 4 signals lines of communication directions, directing line centers online signal, 4 line center lines of travel, set position, 4 lines of communication, 4 lines of calculation screen locations. Inside line condition setting into convergence system, all through mapping, sent line position, operation lines of travel. Correlate communication lines of high centers of 4 centers and 1 XT, 1 rotation, 3 centers of position lines of webbing screens, directing line center, line sync location setting, and communication setting position of clocking. Set barometers, line centers, and rotation graphs, and communication lines of grounds. On center lines of travel, direct lines of platforms, outside signal, inside rotations, graph communication lines of 4 scales of communication. Inside calculation lines, 45 angles, the process indication lines of dimensional line rotations, infrastructure, a new building, and set travel. A new building set in travel. I say we cross the angles again, sets 4 centers, line communications, converts the system of 0 set travel communications and direction. Inside line connection setting, the structure of the line connection setting to convert the system all through travel. Structure of the building. Outline segment line communication position of yards, widths, and lengths. Now we're going to indicate flux line, process lines over screen, and over lines of pi. Massive line of line communication of building, rotation lines of surface and travel. Now we indicate lines of flux over transitions, cells modify settings, seconds on meters, meters on flux, correlation lines of travel, and direct lines of link. That process indicates in the calculations. So we overcross lines, 1 center, 1 traction, 1 division, 1 location, 1 calculations. Okay? Set travels point lines of graph, 3 centers of measure, 3 centers of scale, 4 communication setting calculation. Directing online signals, location of 3 centers of graph and 4 centers, and location of its window frame and travel. So we indicate line condition setting to its converted system of 4 buildings now of infrastructure, outline signals into out of the now. So you got to work with the window processing, directing ground centers into its addressing signals to its engaging of its viewers that modifies the set position of its agencies that process calculations on window frames. Inside rotations and travel calculations. Done by equation. It's all done now. It's all done. All in set calculation. So 4 pyramid activation lines of 1 signal, line conditions and line connecting to high center location of 12 lines convergent system of grounds, powers, atmospheres, and its highways, process line position lines of 3 over 4 over 7 over lines of measure, the process lines of indication line calculate and modify over draft, 0 calculation lines of 144 over lines of pi, process lines of indication setting, 2x 2000 then process lines, and direct lines of 3 centers of scale of communication of position lines of balance, over lines of pi, process lines of portals and stargates, and new sky lines, sky grid, sky panel, sky operation sequence locations. Now it's done by equation. So all infrastructure of pyramids, all set calculation lines, it's now in 24 lines of paradigm. The process lines of position location system, all through tractions, put in all body formation lines and now in lines of sequence, and the portals of stargates, and a new set position in its operation. Done by equation. It's all done now. That's it. So everything I've said now in set lines of sequence is a process that you have to get in position lines of setting now. You have to get in position lines of convergent system and come into calculation screen locations. Your seconds, minutes, and hours are now in 0 line. That over lines of pi, process lines over lines of communications. And net direct lines, erasing line rotation setting, their seconds, minutes, and hours, keeping you in the mind of empty space, processing your system lines of calculation setting. Don't override your sequence, just keep going forward in set positions. So this is about getting out of thinking of no thoughts, no actions, no emotions. Processing your system is just keep going forward out of the now line sequence as set communication lines of travel. Talk to you later.